Hello, I'm Dr. Sherwood Waldron from New York. I'm a psychoanalyst and a psychoanalytic researcher, and I want to tell you about the progress that we've made in figuring out how we help our patients. It's been a long haul because we needed to develop methods of testing and evaluating the processes that are going on in the analytic or the therapeutic hour and the results. So we also had to find out ways of actually having recordings that would give us some material to study. So let me just start with the question of what we need currently to be the goals of psychoanalytic psychotherapy research. Of course, we need to demonstrate that the patient improved, but we also need to demonstrate the patient improved because of our treatment and what elements in the treatment or relationship led to the improvement. So the key is to show a causal connection between process and outcome. And an illustration of that is the impact of relational and technical elements. By now it's become well known that the therapeutic alliance appears to be a powerful correlative of benefit when two people talk to each other in a therapeutic relationship. But the question remains, what is it that helps the patient to function better in their lives? And that's something that we've been systematically addressing. It's been a 30-year odyssey. It was clear way back when that we needed to have a collection of recorded analyses in order to really study what goes on. Now, my cultural background contributed to my becoming instrumental in developing the collection of recordings, because when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, I had the experience of studying under some wonderful leading people, not just psychology, but also anthropology and sociology. And I came to have a great appreciation for having the data, for being able to really study the real thing. So this led me to help in the establishment of something called the Psychoanalytic Research Consortium 30 years ago, with the intention of collecting as many psychoanalyses fully recorded as we could. And you're going to hear more about the results of that and the actual studies that we arranged. But what we had to do in order to do that is that we needed to develop measures based upon listening, clinicians listening to recorded analyses, sessions, measures that would assess the process, and then subsequently measures to assess the outcome. I'll tell you about what we developed. First, we developed something called the analytic process scales, and we were several colleagues and myself, mostly centered in New York. And we assessed aspects of patient communication and quality of participation in response to the analyst. And we assessed core analytic activities by the analyst: interpreting, clarifying, encouraging elaboration, approaching issues that the patient has with self-esteem, the contribution of developmental period, and as well the way the analyst is approaching the patient, what the analyst's feelings come across as being, and eventually the overall quality of the analyst's participation. In order to rate reliably, we had to develop what turned out to be an 81-page APS, that is Analytic Process Scales, coding manual with Bob Sharp as the leading person in developing a series of examples of what it is to make a no or minimal interpretation, for example, or a moderate interpretation, or a really very strong interpretation. And so we have examples at each one of the five, at every other one of the 5 data points. And anybody is welcome to write to me and receive a copy of this, which is very useful for clarifying analytic concepts with students and even for ourselves. So we did that for quite a while, and we found out that no matter what kind of intervention the analyst was making, this was in a series of recordings that we studied, that it was what the clinician raters felt to be high-quality interventions, no matter what their nature was, whether they were interpretations, approaching the transference, approaching defense, whatever. If they were of high quality, the patient responded thereafter, like within the very same session, in a productive way. So we realized that there was something about the quality of what was going on, and this was consistent with the change from a kind of a one-person psychology to a more two-person psychology in the field in general. And we realized that our analytic process scales needed to be augmented. So maybe 10 years ago, we started developing what we call the dynamic interaction scales. These assessed more global aspects of the way that the patient contributed, the way the analyst contributed, and the interaction themselves. For instance, we studied how the therapist was straightforward, or the degree to which the therapist was straightforward, warm, expressing his or her own subjective point of view, responsive to the patient's feelings, and how much the patient flexibly shifted from experience and reflecting. We actually had 12 measures, which I won't go into all of them. And then, an important development. We developed a collaboration with the Sapienza University in Rome, with our colleague Francesco Gazzillo, who led a whole research group to study the 27 cases that we had by this point accumulated of fully recorded analyses. And we studied 20 sessions from each of those cases for a total of 540 sessions, 8 early, 4 in the middle, and 8 late. And they were all rated on our analytic process scales, our DIS, the dynamic interaction scales. And as a consequence, you're going to hear some of the consequences that came from that. But first, I have to tell you that we not only had to measure process scales, but also we had to measure outcomes. It's not so obvious how well somebody is doing. And we found that the best instrument for the purpose was something called the SWAP, which is the Shedler-Weston Assessment Procedure, created by Jonathan Shedler and Drew Weston with a great deal of NIMH support. And let me tell you something about that. It uses clinician judgment to assess change, to assess the patient, and we decided to use it to assess change in the early scores versus the late scores as a proxy for change in the rest of the person's life. Clinicians like myself have had the experience of finding that patients really do benefit, not all, but benefit in terms of the rest of their lives. And we've had personal experiences as well along that line, so that one comes to have a degree of conviction that all this work that an analysis represents is a worthwhile internal education. But how much is there validating external evidence for that? This is what we wanted to be able to show. So, since the SWOP harnesses clinical judgment systematically, we wanted as well to modify it into an outcome instrument. Now, let me tell you more about the SWOP. There are 200 clinical symptoms and characteristics of patients that are evaluated and rated in what's called a Q-sort method. And the choice of the items made by Shedler and Weston was based upon input from hundreds of clinicians, refinement of the items, and the support from NIMH was crucial. Ending up with a nationwide sample of clinicians specifying what they thought was important about their patients, which then was fed back into the items. As well, there are 24 health items added. So, we want to use the SWOP scores from early and late as a measure of change, because some of the other measures like the GAF are just too global and not that reliable generally. So, how could we be sure that a change from an early clinical description to a later one represented an improvement in the patient? We set our mind on developing what we call the Personality Health Index from the SWOP. And it turned out that our clinicians agreed about how sick or healthy each SWOP item was. And to give you an idea, the sickest item, when distressed, perception of reality can be grossly impaired. That is, thinking may seem delusional. The healthiest item is capable of sustaining meaningful relationships characterized by genuine intimacy and caring. So each SWOP item was evaluated by us for the degree of health or sickness, giving us a raw score. And then the main thing that we were able to do is, thanks to Rosemary Kogan and John Porcerelli, who had collected a nationwide sample of 300 SWOPs from analytic patients, this became the population with which we compared our patients and the change in our patients, and you'll see that very shortly. So we were able to develop a percentile score. Somebody could be like at the 10th percentile, meaning very low in terms of their functioning compared to this range of analytic patients. Or, if they're very high, 90, 95% percentile, they're doing great. So this was the improvement in outcome measures that we did. And so then we were able to find out a crucial step in this whole study, which is to demonstrate that the patients benefit. Otherwise, there wouldn't be much point in this intensive study of process unless the outcome had value. So here is the complicated slide that shows the initial level on the PHI, and you'll see that the blue bars, there are 27 bars on this chart, the blue bars represent the original PHI level, and you can see some patients were quite healthy when they started their analytic treatment, and some were in very relatively poor health. The pink bars show the degree to which they change positively or negatively. And generally you can see there's a lot of positive change in the course of the treatments. That is, the changes, the actual is based upon the actual score at the end, the PHI score at the end of treatment, based on the SWOT. 3 patients actually got a little worse, according to our measures, and a couple of patients, no, 4 patients actually really didn't change in a positive direction, but the others did. So we have reason then to be interested in what went on in those cases. And so how were we going to integrate all this data from 39 variables, the analytic process scale, process variables, the dynamic interaction scales? How could we assess this and convey it? Well, what we did is we did a factor analysis to find out what's the analytic structure of the work. And that's the next part of my presentation here. I'm going to show you what came out. It turned out there were 3 therapist factors, only 1 interaction factor, and 3 patient factors. Let me go over them. As you would imagine and expect, and what makes great clinical sense, there's the therapist relational competence and the therapist dynamic competence. These 2, as it were, facets of the therapeutic work. There's a little one in the middle called therapist confronts, which we're not going to have time to really discuss today. Now, for the patient factors on the right, the patient would convey their experiences about his or her world, and another side of the patient's activity was the patient conveying about the analyst and the reaction to the analyst or the analytic situation. Then the most important part, as far as we're concerned, is the patient's dynamic competence. This is where the patient becomes more self-reflective, more able to handle their own feelings, etc. And we can't go into all the details of the various variables that make up each of these. But in the middle, it turns out that in terms of the interaction, the variables that measured interaction among our 39 variables all coalesced into one interaction quality factor. So that's the 7 factors. And now we have a chance to find out how did the level of one factor in a session affect the next session. Because what we have in our 540 sessions, there are 405 sessions. 405, pairs of sessions, in which session A is followed by session B within a day or a few days, the next session sequentially. And if something happens in session A, and then the patient responds in session B, it gives us a chance to look at the causal relationships in a way that really hasn't been accomplished before, because the combination of the database and the measures and the assessment of change from one session to the next simply hasn't been available. So here's what we found. We found that the 7 sessions, 7 factors had a variety of effects from one session to the next. I'm going to go over this with you. Let's take the therapist's relational competence first. And we see that there are actually 4 arrows leading from the patient relational competence in session A, let's call it, and the next session being session B. So what happens is the higher the therapist's relational competence, the more the patient in session B, the next session, is able to communicate about his or her world, the higher the interaction quality, and these are all significant while holding constant the level of the previous session in the outcome variable. The therapist's relational competence leads to the therapist to be able to confront better in the next session. Can't go into the meaning of that, but it also leads to the therapist being able to do his or her thing. Therapist dynamic competence in the next session. There's a good relationship going, and then that improves the dynamic competence. Now, let's now take a look at the therapist's dynamic competence, because this is the thing that analysts believe, that from experience, that if you're able to grasp and convey in a meaningful way to your patient what they're suffering from and what may be maladaptive about what they're doing, that the patient benefits. So yes, the therapist's dynamic competence leads in the next session to an improvement in the patient dynamic competence. Now you can say, well, what are the characteristics of that? What are the variables in each one of those? And we won't have time in this presentation to really go into that. But you're welcome to write me, email me, and I can send you the breakdowns. All of these things are broken down into their specific variables as well. But the therapist's dynamic competence also leads to an increase in the interaction quality, which in turn leads also to the patient dynamic competence improving. So you see each one of these arrows represents session A and its impact on session B. It's interesting too that when the interaction quality improves, the next session the therapist's dynamic competence improves. So you can get an idea of the circular nature of constructive patterns that take place. And this is really very important because we haven't really had the opportunity to study this kind of thing, even though it's something that every analyst is at least to some degree or other aware of as they're working. So I'm going to give you the breakdown of just one of these factors, just to give you a little more of the feeling of it. And I think that's all that we'll be able to do. Let's take the therapist's dynamic competence, which equals the following variables: addressing transference, encouraging elaboration, addressing conflicts, clarifying, and overall good communication. Those five all correlate significantly with subsequent interaction quality. It happens that the interpreting and addressing defenses doesn't reach significance in this particular interaction, this particular sequence. Now, what's interaction quality? The therapist helps with the awareness of feelings. The therapeutic couple is engaged together in the work. The patient responds productively. The patient experiences the therapist as empathic. And the transference, that is the patient's reaction to the analyst in an analytic situation, is connected in a meaningful way to the rest of the patient's life. There's a lot of work in psychotherapy research which shows these same variables as having an impact, a favorable impact on the patient's treatments. So anyway, this is the essence of what we've been able to find out so far with only 27 patients. And what we're really hoping is that more clinicians will realize the importance of studying the ongoing interaction and will record their work, so that instead of having, right now we only have 7 analysts, 27 cases, and wonderful to have 70 in 270 cases. You could do a great deal more in terms of clarifying when it works, when it doesn't work, what and what kind of patient. Key investigations for our field. So anyway, please email me if you wish. There, you can see my email there in yellow. And consider recording your own patients after familiarizing yourself with issues in regard to consent and adequate safeguards for the recordings, thereby contributing to our future. Thank you.